July 1864, Georgia. A young soldier named Robert Kellogg drops his water ration, and without thinking, he leans forward to catch it before it spills into the mud. His fingertips cross an invisible boundary, a thin strip of pine board and posts staked into the dirt 17 feet inside the camp's outer wall. He doesn't even reach the fence. He barely moves. And the guard in the tower above him doesn't ask questions, doesn't shout a warning. He fires. Kellogg dies for the crime of leaning too far forward inside the most crowded, most lethal square mile in North America, a Confederate prison camp called Andersonville, where nearly 13,000 Union soldiers would die in 14 months, more than were killed at Antietam, Shiloh, and Gettysburg combined. The line that killed him had a name. The guards called it the deadline. Now think about the last time you used that word. Maybe it was an email. Maybe your boss said it in a meeting. Maybe you scribbled it in a planner next to a due date for a report nobody will remember in a year. Deadline. A word so ordinary, so drained of danger, that we use it to describe turning in an expense form. But here's the truth history quietly buried underneath decades of office jargon. That word was not born in a newsroom, and it was not born in a boardroom. It was born on a killing field, drawn in the dirt by men who used it to decide, with total legal permission, exactly where another human being was allowed to breathe, and where he was not. So how did a literal execution boundary become the most common word in the modern workplace? That's the question we're answering today. And the answer runs straight through a Civil War atrocity, a war crimes trial, and a printing press a full 60 years later. Let's go back to the beginning, because the deadline didn't start at Andersonville.
Military and civilian prisons had used boundary lines for years before the Civil War. A rope, a ditch, a chalk mark, something to signal the guards are watching, don't test them. But those earlier lines were warnings. Andersonville's was different. It was a death sentence with a fixed geography. The camp opened in February of 1864, built to hold 10,000 prisoners. By August, it held more than 32,000 men, packed into 26 acres, roughly the space of a modern shopping mall parking lot, with a single filthy creek as the only water source. There was no shelter for most of them. Men dug holes in the ground to escape the Georgia sun, and running the entire perimeter, roughly 19 feet inside the stockade wall, was a simple wooden rail, sometimes just a series of stakes with a plank nailed across the top. Nothing imposing. A child could have stepped over it without effort. That was the point. It didn't need to be imposing, because the order given to every guard standing watch in the towers above was absolute. Any prisoner who touched it, crossed it, or in some testimonies even reached a hand toward it, was to be shot immediately. No warning shouted first, no hesitation required. The commandant of the camp, a Swiss-born Confederate officer named Henry Wirtz, enforced this with a rigidity that would later cost him his life. Survivors described starving men shot for stretching toward the shade the boundary rail happened to fall under. Men shot for sleepwalking. One account describes a prisoner deliberately walking to the line and stepping across it, not by accident, but on purpose, because he had decided a fast bullet was kinder than slow starvation. The guards called this act crossing the deadline, and for the men trapped inside it, the phrase needed no further explanation. After the war ended, Henry Wirtz became the only Confederate officer executed for war crimes, and the word from his trial spread through the transcripts, the newspapers, and the congressional testimony that followed. Reporters covering the trial printed the term again and again. Deadline. 2 words at first, describing a specific, horrifying boundary at a specific camp. For a while, that's all it meant. A literal line. A place you did not cross, because to cross it was to die.
Here's the rehook, because this is where the story takes its strangest turn. The word should have stayed buried in Civil War history, a grim footnote next to a war crime. Instead, roughly 6 decades later, it walked straight into American newsrooms, and almost nobody who used it there knew where it came from. By the early 20th century, newspaper printing presses had a mechanical quirk. On the flat bed of a printing press, engravers and typesetters would sometimes mark a literal boundary line on the plate, a line beyond which text or images could not be printed clearly because the rollers wouldn't make proper contact with the metal type near the edge. Print past that line and the words would smear, blur, or vanish entirely off the page. Pressmen started calling that boundary the deadline, too. Dead space, a line you could not cross without the words dying on the paper. And because newsroom culture already moved at a frantic, high-pressure pace, editors began stretching the word to describe something else entirely. The exact moment past which a story could no longer be included in that day's edition. Miss it, and your article was as good as dead. It simply would not exist in tomorrow's paper. 2 very different lines, 2 very different kinds of death. One a soldier's, one a sentence's, converging on a single word, until by the 1920s, deadline had fully shed its wartime skin. Newspapers were writing about deadlines constantly, and readers no longer connected the phrase to Andersonville at all. Within another generation, the word had crossed over from journalism into general business language entirely, describing any moment where a task had to be finished or considered lost. And that's the mechanism still running underneath your calendar notifications today. When your manager says a deadline is hard, they are, whether they know it or not, invoking the logic of that Georgia stockade rail, a fixed, non-negotiable point past which failure carries a real and forced consequence. Psychologists actually studied why deadline language works on the human brain the way it does, and the answer traces back almost perfectly to that original meaning. A boundary with a defined edge and a real penalty triggers what researchers call loss aversion. Your brain treats the threat of missing it as more urgent than the reward of finishing early, because somewhere in our evolutionary wiring, a fixed line with consequences on the other side reads as danger, not as scheduling. Companies didn't design deadlines to exploit that instinct on purpose. They inherited a word soaked in exactly that instinct, and it worked so well, nobody ever questioned why. So the next time a deadline lands in your inbox, sitting there in bold red text demanding a report by 5 o'clock, remember what the word is actually built from. Somewhere in Georgia, in the summer of 1864, there was a real line drawn in real dirt, watched by men with real rifles, and crossing it meant your name went onto a burial list instead of a duty roster. We softened it. We moved it indoors, onto paper, onto screens, into calendars with gentle chime notifications. But the shape of the threat, cross this point and something dies, never actually left. It just found quieter victims. And that raises an uncomfortable question worth sitting with the next time you feel that familiar knot of dread before 5 o'clock. How many of the boundaries running your life today are really about consequences at all? And how many are just old fear, wearing a new, more polite disguise?